welcome everybody to our final panel, our final Zoom event for Cybersquatch 2021. My name is Eric. I'm our tournament director, and that's pretty much all I do. I've been doing HEMA for like, God, 7 or 8 years. And I've been doing Swordsquatch since 2016. Technically, I'm the founding member of Swordsquatch because Beth told me to. So that's how that goes. All right, so everybody, thank you for joining us. Today we have, we want to thank Dillon, Beyer, Jude, Ledesma, Mike, Panian, Andrew, Somlyo for being part of this panel for us. Quick reminders, or I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to be moderating pretty efficiently. There's no appeals process, so if I find you distracting, you're gone. The video will be up on YouTube later, so you can watch it there if I kick you out. Quick reminders for this session: we have a code of conduct. It's on our website. I'll also be kicking you out if you violate that. Black Lives Matter. Be kind to each other. Please be patient with anyone's technical difficulties or aircraft flying overhead. And then we're broadcasting from Duwamish native lands. If you have questions about land acknowledgements or how those work, and you're in the Seattle area, you should go to the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center, where they talk a lot about that history and kind of how that's relevant to us today, because the Duwamish are still here. That's actually their slogan at the moment. We're sponsored this year by Purple Heart Armory. They're great. We have lots of nice things to say about them. If you fail to follow the code, we're going to ban you. And if you need assistance or have a question, please use the comment or the chat box. I will be moderating and monitoring that. Feel free to chat to communicate with each other. And yeah, Andrew, I'm going to hand this off to you. There we go.
Hey, all right, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm your moderator here. My name is Andrew Somlyo. I'm one of the senior coaches at Lonan. My martial arts background is rich and varied. It includes a fair bit of clinch work with a variety of folks in the MMA community down in LA, as well as a fair bit of work with a variety of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu folks there, and then extrapolating that and having worked both teaching a bunch of clinch and stand-up wrestling, both at Lonan and in the Bohurt community. I've been involved in historic European martial arts seriously for about a little over a decade now, and martial arts in general for over 3. So I'm going to try and help move the conversation along. I would like our other participants to introduce themselves. Jude, if you could go first, please.
Okay. Hi. Jude Ledesma. I am one of the founders and the head coach of F3 Sword Academy in Berkeley. That's my main secondary side gig. My main side gig is I'm the competition team coach for Straight Blast Gym NorCal, an MMA gym. Similar to Andrew, I spent about 20 years not seriously training martial arts and about 30 years doing it seriously. So that's a little different. My wrestling background is largely Greco and Muay Thai, which is an odd combination for a lot of people, and clinch work through MMA within the Straight Blast Gym and MMA groups around the world. I've had a ton of fun integrating that kind of approach into my HEMA training.
Dillon.
Hey gang, I'm Dillon Beyer. I've been, I dipped my toe in HEMA once many moons ago and then vanished for a long time until I realized that's where all of my favorite people wound up. So I've been back in and out over the last couple of years, largely with the Pacific Northwest crew and a little bit up in BC. My martial arts background, a big chunk of it was knockdown karate. I'm 5'6" and fight heavyweight. So most of my stuff is impact work from inside their uniform if I can get there. My grappling background is judo and Western wrestling with a coach who is the team lead and training coordinator for Ramsey County SWAT. So I got a lot of time wrestling cops, but it's all from that sort of perspective. I recently fell in love with BJJ. So I'm having a blast picking that up but mostly I like play fighting, and I'm happy to do it with anybody who will get within reach of my stubby little T-Rex arms.
Mike.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Penyon. I started martial arts practice in 1974 doing karate. I did a little bit of wrestling in high school, and as a school teacher, I taught, I was a wrestling coach. So I did that for a number of years. And since that time, I've incorporated wrestling with my other martial training. I've also done, I practiced some judo with a fellow named Hayward Nishioka out of your neck of the woods, Jude, and also some Aikido for a number of years, and a little bit of Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, so I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. Let's sort of dive in here. The central question we're going to ask overarchingly, and I think we should, before we start drilling in, is the central topic for this is how has wrestling affected your view, or grappling affected your view of other martial arts, and particularly your practice of sword work and historic European martial arts? Like, how has that informed that? Jude, I think you're up first. You have your mic on.
Oh, okay.
See?
Yeah. I failed. Okay. Yeah. It actually, I sort of got drawn kicking and streaming into the wrestling thing. I did Muay Thai because I liked it. Grew up with the Greco stuff because my dad made me do it. So I just pushed that stuff to the side, didn't realize that and then I boxed when I was a kid. As I got older, that's what people wanted me to coach. No matter what I tried to do, I always got drawn back into those kind of things. And eventually I just went with it. And that's where the core is. As far as the weapons work with wrestling, I have a Filipino martial arts background. Probably prior to my current training, Andrew's coach was the most influential person for me. And so Filipino martial arts with weapons. So I was familiar with that aspect of it. When it started getting into personal defense with weapons in a modern context, like the Facebook thread currently, goes back to this 1980s surviving edge weapons video. A whole lot of stuff in it, but it comes down to, at the end, there's like one little blurb: put two hands on the weapon, control the weapon arm. And that's basically what happened. Everything that sort of worked that I ran into later on focused on that, and just grew wrestling into it. And then when I started getting involved in HEMA, I saw those same plays repeated over and over again with a wrestling context, because you see the same techniques in like other martial contexts, like say more traditional martial arts. You'll see a wrist lock or something like that, but the wrestling context is removed. So there isn't that wrestling. You just have grab hand, twist it, right? While the wrestling context is like you have to close, hand fight, control that arm, and then lever into whatever is going on, that kind of motion. And that was fascinating for me. And then that actually drew me into the HEMA thing, because I wanted to look at it. I started lurking a whole lot. And then I just decided I like this, and I started a club. So I came into HEMA basically from the wrestling side of things.
Nice, thank you. Dillon, we seem to have an order of operations here. I think you're next in it.
It works for me. I had a little bit of a similar thing. I was, early on, I was mostly an impact fighter, and then got into wrestling because it was what would let me continue to hit people when they didn't want me to. And I came into HEMA kind of sideways through Filipino martial arts as well. My coach is also in Jude's area in the Bay. Is Maya Soderholm, and her weapon system is largely weapon agnostic. It's sort of like a meta system, and so I wound up applying that primarily to the wrestling and striking work that I'd been doing elsewhere, and wound up easing back into HEMA at around that same sort of time. So it informs for me. There's I think you can approach it from either from a biological, like structural perspective, from a social perspective, from a psychological perspective, and I think each of those is an inroad into how, like, they've each had discrete impacts in how I look at weapons or sword work. I don't think you can disentangle it from the grappling in a real way, and I think that gets missed a lot because there's not that. I think a lot of the times in the sword systems, and you see it in the just impact arts in general, traditionally that was an assumed component of the background of everybody involved. And at some point, with your permission, Andrew, I would like to embarrass myself in front of everyone by ranting about mirror neurons in front of you.
We'll get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, being wrong in public is my favorite way to get right.
Yeah.
So, since I've got an expert here, this is of
I'm
course
not an expert on, like, I ain't an expert on that one, but I know a little bit. But it's
yeah, your standard for what is or is not expertise on that may be a little different from the rest of us. But anyway, I don't think you can disentangle them functionally. I think you're missing. There's literally things you can't see that are fundamental to weapons work, in my opinion, if you can't wrestle. So I don't know how it would have impacted it had I gone to the weapon systems first and then added the wrestling in. I don't have personal experience with that. But coming from the other direction, it looks like it's all of a piece to me. So that's the influence I see. It's the first martial arts, and so all other martial arts is going to be scaffolded on that same kind of a core structure.
When I get around, I will back clean up, and I'm going to wholeheartedly agree with you in that viewpoint. I don't think I'm the only one here, but yeah, we're very much on the same page there. Mike, where are you? Mike, what do you have to add here?
If I remember, the question was about how does wrestling inform your martial arts? So,
yeah,
well, a long time ago, my dad was military police during World War II, and part of his job was to go into bars in around Chicago and get drunk sailors and bring them home. And he had lots of stories about that. But my first exposure to grappling was in the context of him showing me how to do a simple shoulder throw in the backyard. I was probably in grade 4. And the very next week, I went to school, and some kid grabbed me exactly the way he grabbed me. And I just did it. And he hit the ground with his eyes this big around, and I had my eyes this big around, and my love affair with martial arts began right then. Another experience with wrestling was in the 60s and 70s, when people started practicing. Things weren't as blended as they are now. So somebody who started, there were very few people actually practiced martial arts back then. And when Bruce Lee came around, people started lomming on to various Asian styles. And when people, even in the way kids fought in real fights, there were rules associated with what was okay and what wasn't. And they were very colloquial. They're like, you're not supposed to kick anybody in the nuts. You know, you're just not supposed to. That was the way things were when I was a kid. And if you did, you were a bad kid. And if you held yourself to some values about what's right and what's wrong, you were a good kid. But of course, that's not the way things really are. And in high school, it wasn't like that. But the division between the way people were thinking about martial arts was very much rule based, consciously and unconsciously. So if you were doing karate, it looked like karate, and if you were doing boxing, it looked like boxing, and if you were doing this, it looked like this. And really, the things didn't meet up very often until later. So I practicing karate at the time, and I go to a dojo in North Carolina, and I was looking for a new place to practice, and one of the guys there was an all-state champion in wrestling, and he said, well, wrestling's actually really important to martial art. And I had been wrestling, but I never thought of it that way. Literally, never thought of it as a martial art, but more of a sport. And it never occurred to me that this was a good thing to think about. So he said, let me show you. So we sparred. And he basically, what would happen. He grabbed me and threw me on the ground, jumped on top of me, and I was helpless. And once again, I went, holy cow, this is amazing. I want to incorporate this as much as I can. So I think it's like that. I think that that if you apply yourself, my answer to your question is that if you are exposed to variations in things, in variations in ways people fight, then certain truths come out. And one of the truths that comes out, and we all know this from watching mixed martial arts, is that the grappling is actually pretty damn important to this, and that was impressed upon me several times as a kid, and also as a young martial artist, and that never really stopped. So, but from that point on, I incorporated wrestling and martial arts into karate, into everything else I did. I searched out other ways of grappling, like judo and aikido, and even though aikido gets a bad rap, there's stuff in it that's useful. And if you take it from out of the context that it's usually taught. Anyway, there you go.
Thank you. I'll throw my 2 cents in there on that. Just for me, there's, my personal exposure to grappling started pretty young. That was, something that was a portion of, my from grade school on that what you wound up doing. I went to a wrestling school, or a school where we did a lot of wrestling. I encountered it in martial arts, and it became a practical skill for me to use when I was having to do things more practically at various times through my development. As I started, I started out the first martial art I started doing formally for years at a time, besides doing some wrestling. And a few other things, but a little fencing before, a little bit of Aikido as a very young child, was Okinawan karate. And I started looking into the history of that. And then as I dug more into that, and what you started to discover was that Okinawan karate was all predicated on the idea of knowing Okinawan sumo and Okinawan stand-up wrestling, that you couldn't really abstract that. And when you saw karate migrate over to Japan, all of that first generation of Funakoshi's black belts all also trained with Jigoro Kano. They were all cross-trained in judo. That essentially everything we knew about Okinawan and Japanese martial arts, when you looked into the history of it, was predicated on a knowledge of wrestling. I got involved in Southern Chinese martial arts and interested in the question of Chinese internal arts. And then I started looking at the largely northern Chinese internal arts. And it's like, when you look, it's like, well, there was a village spear, so there's a spear system that wound up likely adapted into one village as their long weapon system, and that village had a wrestling system, as did every northern Chinese village. And that's likely, or at least one model for how Xingyi met Chen Taiji, or Chen villages wrestling and became Chen Taiji. And when you look at almost all northern Chinese martial arts, they are predicated on the idea of knowing wrestling and knowing a method of wrestling. Then, as I saw these two things in these two major areas of what we call martial arts, I began to really realize that almost every culture has a wrestling tradition, and that to look at a martial art without assuming that there is wrestling there or a knowledge of it is to sort of neglect like a fundamental assumption that almost every culture where there is physicality tends to have a wrestling tradition. I'm sure you can find some exceptions somewhere, but they tend to be out there. For me, coming to that, having been a pretty good clinch background by then, when I started getting involved with HEMA, and then reading Fiore, where I started, really, was the first place, Fiore and Silver, where I first dove in deeply and where my loyalties lie most strongly. When you read Fiore and you start his grappling session, he makes this overt statement. There is the wrestling that we all know how to do, the type you do with friends for fun. This is not that wrestling. This is the wrestling that we do in earnest, before he begins his collection of tricks. And that sentence to me was incredibly evocative, because when you combine that with Fiore's statement, all fighting is wrestling, what it says that if you're doing Fiore and you aren't doing some form of stand-up wrestling and you don't know how to wrestle, you don't actually understand Fiore. And I would argue that that's probably true for a large number of the historic European arts that we talk about. Monte certainly is very dear to me and catalogs the local folk styles extensively. And it's just like as everyone's sort of saying here, it's like, okay, it's really important. Well, moreover, from a historic standpoint, it's a necessary precondition, at least for almost everything prior to the 18th century. I don't know 18th century sources well, but certainly, even when you look at the German stuff, there's a great catalog of German folk style wrestling. It's clear that this was a portion of the tradition. So that it's to me that it is, you're blind, you're missing a huge piece if you don't have that there. And I think that's the historic piece I think that I fixate on most. Yeah, my 2 cents there. Dillon.
Just on that specific, like that exact topic for it, I had seen a lot of debate around it, like interpretations of basic stuff for Fiore. In particular, as I was getting back to him, I had initially started in a German school. So Fiore was new to me in the last couple of years, and it was really interesting to go to the text and look through it, because a lot of the debate around what was happening didn't make sense. It was fairly obvious in a lot of the cases what Fiore was doing, because it was based on like the actual underlying structure of it makes total sense if you have the perspective of coming in from that direction. And I think one of the things that's been difficult coming from a wrestling, grappling, takedown sort of background into the HEMA sort of community culture is it's sort of hard to extract, and maybe this is something we can touch on a little bit later with everybody, hard to extract what is reflexive or natural or conditioned if you have that perspective from the perspective of somebody who doesn't have it, like seeing somebody freak out when they go upside down, and having forgotten that that's a human reaction. I think it was really difficult for me to sort of extract a chunk of that, because like when I looked at Fiore, the majority of it was really, I thought, maybe I'm overly simple in my reading, but I thought it was really, really clear what he was getting at. Probably 80 to 90% of the panels in it, because it's stuff that just makes sense if you're seeing it from those eyes. As an unrelated piece of trivia tied into what you were saying about native wrestling cultures and historical martial arts systems around the world, one of my favorite little tidbits on that in the Kyokushin, the full contact karate setup, is Masoyama, who founded Knockdown Karate, was initially training in a Goju Ryu school. And the senior student at that Goju Ryu school was Masahiko Kimura. So as far as like how routinely that was tied together, Kimura was Oyama's senior student in his early karate school. So then even in those traditions, it's shocking how fast that falls apart. Most knockdown guys can't grapple, even though their teacher's like training buddy was a guy who has jujitsu names named after him. So I think that's and you'll see that like you were saying, Andrew, that's everywhere. You see it with the Shuai Jiao backgrounds, Shuai being one of like Shuai and Na. So throwing and locking stuff are some of the fundamental backgrounds in any Chinese martial arts system. And I think a lot of the stuff that doesn't make sense in those systems doesn't make sense to people who aren't doing those foundational arts or don't have a traditional background in any of that. And by traditional, I don't mean like orthodox martial arts. I mean a cultural, like who haven't roughhoused. I think roughhousing, even if you're taking it down more fundamental than wrestling, technical wrestling, there's an assumption of roughhousing in all of this. And I think that that's lost in a lot of the modern iterations, and it's shocking the difference in your ability to see what's going on that makes.
Yeah. Yes. I would, to add on to that, and please, if anyone else can expand, one thing I would say in terms of things you get from things that where a wrestling practice will inform your sword work, and where it gets very important. Roughhousing, you mentioned how people freak out when they go upside down. Well, also one of the things that is lost, particularly in modern culture, is people do not roughhouse much when they're children, particularly people who come to HEMA. There are also very different ideas of personal space and touch. And one of the first things you really, really up close and personal learn in a grappling art is getting used to being in cuddling range, getting used to being touched, pushed, pulled, moved around. And that's actually a huge psychological barrier, I think, for a lot of students. I think that's the fact that people have not moved past that often interferes with some of their ability to work with interpretations or understand things. They don't understand quite how close you have to get there. And that, when you look at how that both informs, I think, all of our practices, anyone who has wrestled is way more comfortable being body to body and doesn't think about that being a barrier. We don't worry about touching each other, right? I mean, even when you're instructing, you're probably less likely to worry about it. Mike.
Another thing that I think wrestling does to add to martial arts in general is it is a way of safely increasing intensity, both in effort and in tension. It's in both in the training process and also in when you're competing. When you are learning wrestling, like what I'm speaking about right now is my own experience in North American folk style wrestling, the kind of stuff you do in high schools and colleges. The level of intensity of the training is something that you see in other athletics, but it's pointed and focused at martial intent. And if somebody has that experience, and then they get into a fight, that comes out, and it is extremely potent. Just even if you're not that good, if you have that intensity, you become a little bit scary. And what I see happening in HEMA is if you can get on YouTube and watch iterations of grappling, HEMA grappling, people trying to wrestle, and over the years, more and more people who have real wrestling or judo or other combatives in their background will come into the play, and the level of wrestling is going up because of it. And it also can do the same thing with you build that intensity in wrestling, and then when you're fighting with swords, the same energy can be there. So it can still be safe, but the level of intensity can go up. Yeah, in fact, that's probably one of the advantages, is that wrestling allows you to do it safely. Yeah.
Thank you. Jude, you have something to add?
Yeah, I took myself off mute. Took notes, so that's awesome. Yeah, so like what Mike was saying, as far as in the intent and the intensity of the practice, it's very easy to make it scalable. That's that's one of the big advantages of grappling practice. It doesn't have to be drop the person on its head on the first day all the time, right? It's sort of have this built-in regulatory mechanism within what's going on, and similar to what Jigoro Kano did, was put together the things that you can train with the most intensity as safely as possible. And then that goes to your Andrew's point on Fiore, and then you can add the wrestling in earnest on top of that. And that seems to be, you have this sportive scaffolding, and then you have this earnest wrestling on top. But if you try to do the earnest wrestling without the scaffolding, it's just, there's nothing there. And then as far as that rang a bell about the touching in personal space thing, and coming from wrestling background, my first sport fencing, Olympic fencing class in college, they spent an entire class with people getting used to being poked. That was because there was an aversion to it, and a lot of people had that. So it was a big acclimation session, was one of the very first things we did.
Thank you. Dillon.
I totally agree with you on that, Jude. Spot on with that. Mike, I was really hoping you would actually bring you would talk about that exact point, as we've talked about in the past, and I really like your perspective on it. And I think there's an interesting sort of sideways movement from there. So you have the capacity to ramp up the intensity in training safely, and that's huge. And then you can bring that intensity to the fight or to other areas of training. There's no doubt about that. I think the other side of it is that you also get used to operating at intensity safely. And I think if you don't have exposure to that, not just will it make you less likely to win, but that's when you see people who suddenly wind up in a pressure situation for the first time freak out. There's a lot of people who will work on things like, Mike and I have talked about this at length in other formats, on developing virtue and building character in training. And that character then supports your technical work as well. And I think one of the things I see missed, particularly in Eastern martial arts classes, is that they'll try to sterilize the training in a way to make it accessible, because their focus is on building those sort of more abstract attributes. But you can't build courage except in a situation that requires more courage than you have. And the grappling work allows you to do that sort of thing with a margin of safety that can keep everyone protected. And even from a purely technical perspective, the ability to operate at a high level of arousal without losing your ability to think clearly. It ties into what you said, Andrew. Having somebody, I always said if I had kids, I would want them to swim, do track, do gymnastics, and do judo or another form of wrestling, not for self-defense specifically, but because once you've done that, somebody being very close to you is no longer a tool they can use to panic you. It creates a situation, it creates a physically safe space to do an emotionally dangerous thing. And I think that has some really big implications, both as Kano said, like bringing it back into the world, and technically a lot of the more technical blade work falls apart for a lot of people under pressure. And it's the under pressure part. It's not that they need to develop that skill, like the winding or whatever they're doing under pressure. It's that they need the ability to operate using their entire array of cognitive faculties under pressure. And I think the wrestling is probably the easiest way to access that sort of thing.
Is it possible to share screen at this point? Can I do that?
We should be able to. Let me see.
You should have that ability, yeah.
Okay, I'd like to share a brief clip of Dan Gable coaching. Is that all right with the rest of it? Okay, let me see if I can do this. If I fall off or something, I'll come back.
While you're getting that going,
Yeah.
that was actually the point I wanted to add on. And that's actually Gable's coaching books, and looking at Gable coaching has been important for me as a coach. But that's one of the things that you'll see is that one of the things that's really useful about training in any combat sport gym, but a grappling gym or wrestling in particular, is it gives you a better sense of what effective coaching and effective training looks like and what intensity looks like. Let's see, I'm looking forward to this.
Okay.
With some conditioning. It's like practice starts like this, talking. You end with conditioning on a daily basis, depending on what day of the week it is, just how much. Okay, here we go. Pablo, you got the dummy. You're going to be doing stance in motion, body faking, down blocking. You're going to be doing defense drills, and you're going to be doing faking, but you're going to be doing down blocking where the head comes down to the knee, blocks him coming in, like I told you on Sanderson. When people shoot on him, they got to get their head over there and square. They shoot over here, they got to get their head over and square. We're doing that drill, and then once you get done, you come up, high knee, high knee, high knee, circle. Same thing here, same thing here. Blocking, then high knee. You do it the whole time he's doing these dummy throws. Okay, dummy throws. We're gonna do 4, okay? Once you step, you throw. And you don't ever let go of your hands. And you're on your knees, you pop it up, and then when you come to your feet, when the second step up, you throw again. And you pop it if you can. 4 in a row. Just practice it once to see if you can do it. Good, break. Don't lock first. Step in and throw. Get lower, get lower. Get lower. Ready? You guys, no, don't throw it into him. Ready? Hit it. 4, 1. Come on, jerk it up. Jerk it up. Come on. 2. Jerk it up. 3. Get more of a throw. 4. Got to get more elevation. You got to have this head go all the way through. All the way through. Let's go. Take a break here. Take a break. Here we go. One more time. Another set of 4. Well, wait a minute. No. Let me see here. 6. 6. But I'll tell you, if you don't start doing a little bit more arch, you can't throw them on top of you. You got to get up underneath them. You got to get up underneath. You got to pop your hip, and as you throw it, you got to bang it. You can't throw it on top of you. Here we go. 6 tough ones. You got to jerk and go. Here we go. Ready? Not as good as you should be. No, you got or less than perfection. Ready? Hit it. Boom. Swing that thing all the way through and pop it. Back this way. Come on. There. That was a good one. 3 to go. That was not bad. Get it through, way farther through. 2 to go. No good. No good. Elevate. Come on. Pull it up. Pull it up. 1 to go. Come on. No good. Pick it up. Come on. Not even going to count that set. Bring it up. Pick it up. You're going down backwards. The ones you do good, you step in and lift and throw. And the dummy should go all the way through, not hit on his head. It should go all the way through. When you really get your hip in, you're doing well. Okay, here we go. Final 6. Final 6. Here we go. Last one. Just about done. Just about done. Final 6. Get over here in the middle. Get your hip down. Every time, get your hip down and step in. Ready? Bang it. 1. Not bad. Now take your time. Hit it. 2. Pick it up. Step into it and throw it. No good. Pick it up. Pick it up. Pick it up. Get it up. Hit it. Good one. Keep your hands locked. Come on. 3 to go. Pick it up. Do a little extra conditioner. Pick it up. And 2 to go. Smack it up. 1 to go. 1 more to go. Come on. Pick it up. Get some elevation. Elevate. 1 more. 1 more. Come on. Come on. 1 more. Get some elevation. No good. You got to get elevation. Come on. Come on. Elevation. You know what that means? What's it mean? What's it mean? Okay, get it. Let's go. Come on. Let's go. Elevation. Yeah, okay, good.
Nice.
Yeah. So I thought you guys might find that interesting to talk about.
Wrestling on the feet has been one of the most basic
Oops,
features of our
hang
sport
on.
for centuries, from ancient Greco-Roman to modern freestyle and folk style forms.
There we go. All right.
My,
back.
my intro to wrestling, like literally the first grappling that I did was briefly with Cameron Quinn, who was one of Masayama's Uchideshi, who is currently training with one of Dan Gable's students. So that just gave me flashbacks, that video.
What I like about this guy, Dan Gable, when his own practice was super intense. And what I like about this little clip is he's really engaging with this kid. And this is a simple exercise. It's simple in concept, what he's trying to get the guy to do, but he's demanding a lot of him. And in the process of treating him in this way, he's building a kind of intensity, and you can see that intensity that actually exists in really good wrestling matches starting to come out of this kid as he's doing this thing. And it hits on the level of real physical challenge that wrestling can be when you're really pushing it. So I really like this as an example of like kind of a goal to try to help people get to in the pedagogy of it, is to start to touch on building that into what people are doing. So yeah.
A thing I would add on there, looking at that with Gable, there are a couple things that I think, that he's doing. One is he's talking the kid through, which may not be as useful retention-wise, but may be useful in generating that intensity and building that, which may have its own merits there in terms of skill stuff, and getting him to perform at a higher level with the same skill. The thing that's like really notable there is he's requiring a smaller number of reps at a higher level of intensity, at the level of intensity that he expects for performance under combat conditions, under skill performance conditions. And that's a difference between the way wrestlers will drill and the way some BJJ folks will drill, and with varying success. And one of the things that I think distinguishes wrestling versus the way a bunch of different HEMA practices tend to drill. There are a bunch of folks who focus on quantity over quality, and this is a place where Gable is focusing on quality a great deal. He wants the thing to be right, and it's not do 1,000 of these. It's all right, I want to try and get a couple of good reps out of you under pressure, because you need to know how to do it right. Because once you know what right is, now you can practice right. But if you never get to what right is in that level of intensity, you're never going to actually be able, it's not going to magically appear when the intensity goes up.
We just had that come up on a different coaching conference call with people discussing doing HIIT work for like 45 minutes. And I'm like, if you can do an hour of HIIT, there's no I in it. Like you're missing the HI. It's not intense. If you can maintain, like if your top gear is something that can drive evenly for an hour solid, you're not actually maxing out generally. And I think that's a really interesting, since that there's a lot of the idea that the intensity or the arousal level is maintained across pace or across, it's like you'll have a skill quality that you can express at a low intensity. And a lot of the assumption is the idea is to get it perfect at that low intensity, and then somehow that'll translate to the higher intensities. And without drilling this skill work at that higher intensity, like it's a different skill at a different arousal level and with a different intensity level, which is why Tai Chi players notoriously don't fight great.
Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard the line from Tabata, the guy after whom the intervals are named, who essentially, after the initial, the training protocol that he developed that everyone uses his name for with showed better improvements in aerobic and anaerobic endurance than almost any other protocol he had tried with elite level athletes. That's the other piece, is that was with the Japanese Olympic speed skating team. And his line on that, doing that 5 times a week with highly trained Olympic level athletes, was, if they are anticipating doing it or looking forward to it, they're not doing it hard enough. That, when it comes to high intensity training for that, in that case, which was VO2 max, that these highly conditioned, highly motivated athletes looked at it as a giant pile of suck. And anyone who's, if you think you're doing 45 minutes of hit, yeah, there ain't no intensity there.
Yeah, one of my coaches is a national record holder in discus and Olympic weightlifting and a few other like very high level explosive athletics. And his comment was, I did a Tabata in 1984, and once I've recovered, I will do a second one.
Nice. Nice.
Another counterpoint to this is and we've had, I think in the last time we talked, we had a bit of a discussion about this stuff, is that often people will come into wrestling, like if you're trying to teach people wrestling in HEMA, it's still the case that a lot of folks that come in are not young kids. They're people who need to, they may never achieve that level of intensity that young man generated, because they just can't at this point without a lot of work. So there's also a way to proceed that pushes people towards this without overwhelming them, I think. And I didn't want to imply by showing that clip that all of wrestling practice should be like that. But I think that's a goal. That is something that you can, if you've done wrestling, you know that's what it's supposed to feel like, and you can help people go there or get along the road.
And conversely, because of the nature of wrestling, a lot of clubs or competitive groups, you can want, and I've seen this in HEMA recently, when I started looking at groups more broadly, you get a kind of a survivor's bias that starts growing out of there, right? You can have a really crappy wrestling program, but run a good mat. So what's going to happen eventually, the only people you have left are the people that can put up with your bad coaching methods. And because they drill at that intensity, they're all good, but they're all one body type, one mentality, one walk of life kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's, something that people need to watch out for a little bit. And that's the impression some people get from that, because all they've been exposed to in school or whatever have been those kind of experiences, right? They've got that Shark Tank wrestling mat, or that Shark Tank boxing gym, or that whatever, right? And there's always something like that when you have a live combative sport. There's that possibility of that developing, but it's not as inherently as rewarding, and you're having an ultra high attrition rate too. So that's not a good thing at all.
It's definitely really easy for any of this sort of thing where you can. So for all that, everybody here I know is in favor of appropriate intensity in training. As you're saying, the other side of that coin is it's really easy for anything where intensity can substitute for accuracy to wind up with it being a selection process and not a development process.
Yep.
Yeah, it's balancing technical work and intensity, balancing a level of intensity at which technique is developed, can break down and be refined, is kind of the edge you got to live on as a coach. And that's not something that most athletes who are coming to learn a thing and are in that state of sort of maybe conscious incompetence, conscious competence, which is where like most people are living, as opposed to real unconscious competence where they really are quite good, or like getting at the point where they're an actual competitor. They're not really there, and it's very hard for them to gauge where they're just adding intensity, doing something poorly, or whether they're adding intensity and figuring out at a point where they're able to figure out that thing and learning to do a thing more intensely. It's, thinking about that Gable clip right there, when you looked at what was going on, Gable was keeping asking that kid for intensity, but at the same time, he was giving that kid 2 really specific cues, 3 actually, but one is, don't lock your arm, don't lock in and do it. Basically, make your penetration and make your throw as you're locking. So you're not like bothering to just lock up. 1, 2, get underneath them. 3, you know what elevation is, right? High, you know what elevation is. He's giving him external cues. And you could see where Gable is like, again, the feedback was at the time, which you can go back and forth on that, but I ain't gonna argue with Jan Gable's results, but he's picking out, okay, that's a good rep. That one's a good rep. He's letting the kid know, but it was clearly this thing, and he was giving really specific cues to up the intensity. It wasn't just do it harder. It's do this, do that. And that's one of the places we're having a good coach on the side with a good eye is important for learning how to get people to ramp up the intensity on the right thing.
That's on a general pedagogy thing. Like you said, there's a few points there that could be a little nitpicked with it. But just to highlight for some of the language you're using, Andrew, it's worth noting that Gable was cueing, not instructing. And that's the kid already knew all of these things, and that had been done prior to this. So there are cues designed to get a response, to bring something up. He was not telling him how to do it from a zero baseline. So they didn't come in hot like that.
Yeah.
They built up to that position.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. I think everyone here sort of makes that, whether they do it unconsciously or consciously. Coaches cue, right? They cue to help development, and that's a separate thing from a separate but related thing to instruction necessarily, right? So one is you're imparting the skill itself, and then the other one is once that's sort of built to something you can develop, you try and put it into context and increase that, we could say that intensity and that level of arousal. You want to try and reach that and spend most of your time there. And that little teaching piece, you want to shrink it as much as you can, right? And if you're not able to teach it quickly or in that succinct a manner, that's on the coach to try and develop that. And as Andrew was saying earlier, having that, what was it that, I'm not quite sure how he phrased it, a low number of, a very
low number of high
small,
quality, high quality reps,
That's it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the way to go. And when I have visiting coaches to my fencing club, I either get, for people that wrestled before, you run it like a wrestling mat instead of a fencing club. I get that, and other people don't understand why I chose to structure it that way. But that's how it goes.
I think that just something that, it's sort of on topic with this in terms of like what wrestling and grappling has brought to all of our practices. I think one of the things we're getting to, and that Mike has very nicely brought up here with this Gable clip, is it's taught us how to coach and what intensity and what sort of coaching and what sort of training is required to generate performance under adverse, unstable conditions with a resisting opponent. Because the reality is, whether you do it, create the meat grinder, which does work. I mean, meat grinders make sausage ultimately, and we're trying to make sausage. We just prefer not to, you can do it in a nice way or not so nice way, and you can incorporate more parts or less, however you want to put, far you want to push that metaphor, right? But whatever you wind up doing, when you're used to a grappling practice and you've gone through and done some competitive grappling of any form and you've seen that coach, now when you want to go do any form of sword practice, you have that information, right? You know what effective coaching to try and get someone to be able to apply against resistance looks like. You may not have the one true code, and there's no one true way to do it, I'd say, but you do have a picture of what that is. And that honestly is often very, very different from the picture of someone who has done a martial art or physical practice that is not used to performing under unstable conditions against resistance, you know, where performance is regularly gauged by success or failure on some external metric.
I got another clip.
Yeah.
This one, I know you, if you'll indulge me, I know you've all seen this before, and the reason that it came up was because people were shook up by the lack of training that the fellow had in terms of making the person be safe. So let me share this so we can talk about it. That's not it. Hang on.
Andrew, I could not agree more with everything you just said. That might be one of the biggest benefits, I think.
Yeah.
Ditto.
I gotta get out of here. Technical difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is one of the things is you go into any combat sport gym and you start to see what that looks like, and it will inform your practice elsewhere. You know, and that again,
Okay.
Yeah, bear with me.
Here it is.
Okay. Andrew, please let me lead on comments after this, please.
Sure, you got it, Jude. I have
Thank
my
you.
thoughts too.
Thank you.
That was it.
Yep. Can you replay that in slow motion, please? Like 3/4 speed just before we go, just so people sort of see what's going on and let everyone can form their own opinions on this as they move.
Let's see.
There you go.
Okay.
All right. Let's go. Jude, you're up first.
Okay. Yeah, I'm resigning from Hemo Alliance GC anyway. Probably. I'll talk about this. Okay. So I think I'm a little freer for this. It's this is one of the reasons that I'm probably resigning. It's all the controversy this kind of thing has been doing, and it's been weighing on me a lot. I'm in the background. I'm in the yellow socks talking to my friend Tyson when this happened. I guess broadly, I'm friends with both of them. I am closer friends with the thrower than the throwee. Honestly, so let's go rules wise, right? So I guess that's the first thing. It was within the scope of the rules. They did rules videos. If it wasn't clear, a particular question was asked about high amplitude throws in the rules meeting. I don't know why that was overlooked and no one's brought that up, but in the rules meeting that was brought up and it was answered. Those were allowed because this particular tournament was supposed to be more grappling friendly, right? The other thing is that mat has puzzle mat on top of foam. It's at least as thick as the tatami further back in that gym. So that's another one. So that's overall context, right? Next thing, after the throw, no one had a problem with it for about a week, 2 weeks. No one had a problem with it at all. Nothing was brought up at the time. Nothing was brought up at the end. And then it was brought up again. 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 And then it was Nothing was brought up after. No one emailed, nothing until the throwee posted something saying, do you guys think this was too hard, or something to that effect? And that's when everything blew up. So the original clip was posted by the throwee, and that happened. So that's the full context. Personally, like I said, they're friends with both of them. The throwee is a little bit of a prima donna as far as his performance and stuff. Really good guy, but is very focused as to what he's doing and that kind of a thing. The thrower, Ryan, is ridiculously competitive and maybe not necessarily in a safe way in this context. So my thing is, as a grappler and being there and so on and so forth, I saw absolutely nothing wrong with what happened. However, as this has gone on for years, I realized the disparity in skill is a real big thing in the HEMA community. And I don't know how to deal with that at all. I brought in Eric's idea of doing a minimal skills test in another forum. And all these people started crapping on me for just even bringing it up. And I'm just sort of like, well, what's going on, right? Do you want to wrestle or not? And they go, just sign the waiver and let him wrestle. I'm like, that's what happened, right? That's exactly what happened. And you guys did this, and that's exactly the parameters and what was going on there. So I think I do think it was unsafe, not because of the rules or because of everything that was going on. It's unsafe because you had a person that wrestles really well and who, like I think Mike was alluding to, didn't really care how the other person landed. And a person who didn't have basic falling skills or anything.
That's been the topic of this clip, that side of it. And I'm glad that I have given you the opportunity to talk about it. But what I was actually bringing this up for is for a different reason. And we can, talk about this from this context more if you want. But the thought I had when I watched this recently was about the transition from sword fighting to wrestling. And so I imagine this, when I watch this, I go, okay, so here's this thing where people are trying to learn to sword fight, and what they do is unconsciously make a set of rules about what's appropriate and what isn't, whatever the situation is. And in all martial arts, we tend to do that, right? So like, we have this set of things that we think karate is, and that's what we do. And we have this set of things that we think boxing is, and that's what we do. And then when people are trying to do longsword fighting, there's a certain set of parameters that they will. I've seen discussions in, I think, the George Silver group that get nuts about limiting how you should be thinking about things to a stuff that's going on inside what is considered to be okay and what isn't okay. Okay, and then you look at a situation like this, and at this point, I appreciate the issue about safety. That's something that we talked about before, and I'm again, Jude, I'm glad you brought it up you talked about it tonight because it's important. But what about if you know that there's a guy that could come at you like that, and you're sword fighting, and he does that to you, how would that change your practice?
Yeah.
You know, like somebody's coming at you in a real fight and they do that to you, you're not going to want them to be that close to you ever if you can avoid it. If you know they could do that, might be one thing you'd think about. So that was what I was thinking about when I saw this for tonight's talk. This is about the transition from sword fighting to wrestling, and how powerful that transition change can be when somebody's expecting sword fighting and what they get is wrestling. You following where I'm heading with this?
Yeah, totally. And that level of expectation, I think that goes into what you were talking about, those unwritten rules of fights when you were younger, those kind of things. One of the athletes I coached a long time ago, he's sort of moved on by himself. He wrote a paper about cultured dog brothers. They're folks that do full contact stick fighting and so on and so forth, right? Supposedly, there's no rules other than don't sue people, leave as friends, that kind of thing, right?
You do the same IQ you came in with. Everyone goes home with the same IQ you go in with.
Exactly, that kind of thing, right? So that's the general rule. I mean, the only two written ones, right? But what he did was this nice sociological, analysis of it, in the fact that rules just sort of start to happen or organically, right? So when you have social groups engaged in combatives, whether it's an in-group or an out-group, those ideas of what's okay and what's not okay wind up developing organically. And when you have groups that have a different idea of what's okay, that's the kind of thing that Mike was saying. You have a group that's we're just talking about this on a social media thread. You have an expectation of just swords or whatever, and someone wrestles, but it's supposed to be part of it, and I don't know how that happens and that kind of thing. It's we want to keep everyone safe, have a nice inclusive community, but I was talking to someone else just last night how I'm really torn on that whole thing. That's it's really difficult, and I thought Eric's idea of having that like a basic skills screening was a great one until I got shit on about it. So that's just sort of a weird thing for me.
If I could jump in here, Andrew, just in defense of Jude and then also myself. Also one thing, Ryan has competed at a Swordsquatch tournament.
Yeah.
And I've met Ryan and he was a nice guy. And then also we talked with his coach at the time, Yan and the SETI Institute, and they were outstanding to communicate with about any issues that we had. They were just amazing people, like great coaches, very concerned about safety. I don't have anything not nice to say about that. And also, like, we did our skill screening this year. Unfortunately, I don't know if that got live streamed or not. It was my goal to, but having people compete in the tournament in which takedowns are legal and not checking in the HEMA community for people to be able to fall is the equivalent of having a tournament with steel swords where thrusting is legal and not checking for gorgets. In terms of the amount of trauma that can be done to a person, if you value your competitors having intact spinal cords and intact tracheas at the end of the day, if they can't throw and you're letting people throw them, then I mean you can't expect what you don't inspect, as I think an engineer who's on our team says. If you don't check for falling technique when you let people get thrown, then you are setting yourself up for injuries and for expectations and complaints and that's just the reality of it. And I can't say that strongly enough. At Swordsquatch, we believe in checking for throws and setting expectations. and setting expectations for those for that competition. And so, Jude, whatever people are telling you, it's 100% horse shit. You should check this
Yeah,
out.
that was my basic take, and it just
Mhm.
sort of pushed me off the edge as far as
Yeah.
everything's concerned about that.
I'm gonna shut up now because I've talked too much. But yeah, if you and like, why are you signing up for a tournament where you're gonna get thrown where you can't fall? Anyway,
I get
jumping in on this, like again, like it's Jude, you should be able to safely manage and defend yourself within the context of the event that you're participating in. That is not a exclusionary ask if it's going to be a portion of the rule set, right? And I've heard some of this same garbage too. And part of it feels like people very much want to have their cake and eat it too. Oh, we want to work the documents and do the historic and work out of historical sources, include wrestling in our longsword tournament, but we want to make sure that everyone is always safe and we don't have to do any work to wind up being safe, learn anything else, or take any extra measures, and then we'll blame the person who's good at the thing that we're saying we should know how to do. It seems to be the philosophical stance of that group. I mean, like that throw that Ryan did, I was around when he was competing at Swordsquatch, marshaled him, coached him in a workshop. He's a good athlete. He made a nice crisp throw. I don't really have an issue with safety. The kid he threw landed flat. He didn't put him on his head or his shoulder, and he had a nice control position, and he didn't like land with prejudice and try and break ribs. I mean, there are ways to make that an ugly throw, I mean, and that was clean. Yeah, it was clean, crisp, snappy, but it wasn't like trying to break someone. It was like, get off me, get down there now.
Right. Yeah. So just for clarification, like I said, I'm a bit emotional about this whole thing. Especially since it sort of started going viral again on the BJJ side, because I'm there. And then so I have every other jiu-jitsu friend sending me this clip over and over and over again. So yeah, just for clarification, like Ryan's awesome. What I said, he is ultra competitive. And what I meant by not caring how the person lands, meaning he threw him as if the other person knew how to wrestle. That's what I meant. I didn't mean he was trying to put his head into the mat. He's doing that. And then to clarify the prima donna thing, I think I just picked the wrong word about Ramon. It's just more that what's going on in the match or the appearance of the match to me seemed to be more important to him than what was actually going on and what actually happened there. Because even his coach talked to Paul, the organizer, and they go, oh, it was okay. And then, at the end of the day, everyone said it's okay. And it still comes up and it's still whatever. And that's it. And then Ryan, because of all this stuff, Ryan doesn't do HEMA anymore. So
that's too bad.
That's because of all that. Yeah, he doesn't do HEMA anymore. But the good thing is he's a JITS guy now. So that's good.
I was going to say, Jude, not getting that clip sent to me 85 times today when I saw that going on is like 90% of the reason I'm excited. None of my old training partners have realized I'm a JITS guy now.
Nice.
There you go.
Oh.
So once again, like the reason I included this today wasn't to put you on the spot or to bring this up.
No. I do appreciate it. I mean, it gave me a chance to vent a little bit. I think maybe some people got something out of that.
Yeah. Well,
and like you said, that transition thing is powerful. To just understand.
Yeah. Well, that when I think about how wrestling informs sword fighting, this is what I'm trying to talk about here with that clip is aside from the controversies around that, same things with punching and kicking included in sword fighting. If you're in the middle of fighting and you do this as a way of practicing sometimes, then there's really clear places where you can make these transitions to including just palm healing the guy in the face and changing the fight completely when you do that kind of thing. And how does that affect how you teach sword fighting was the question I was getting at. For me, the knowledge of wrestling always is included in the using of weapons or punching and kicking as well, because it's there and it changes the game completely. And there's things that you would get away with doing, or that you think you could do, that you can't really do if the guy can grab you and wrestle you down. And that, I think, is really important.
I'll tack on to that. My absolute favorite Swordsquatch rules penalty is the one that the defender probably should have gotten for this: failure to defend.
Yeah.
Right, and actually penalizing people for, we see, back of the head, penalties for striking to inappropriate targets, back of the head or the back, but you don't see people often getting penalized for turning their head.
Exactly.
Hand blocking.
Yeah.
And you know what? Falling over when someone walks towards you, like if I'm sure we've all, if you at tournaments have seen someone moves in and the other person just falls over. And while anyone can trip and that can happen, you don't really see that happen in wrestling tournaments. And that sort of speaks to, on a deeper level, failure to defend, not being ready for the fact that someone may be moving towards you. And it actually is, that shouldn't be happening. Like that should be and honestly, it should be, you should get penalized for it if you do. If you fall down in front of someone while they're heading towards you with a sword, you probably have not done really well.
There was go ahead.
There
was an era. I'll go, just because I hate sitting at the stoplight almost going with someone. An era in, like, especially towards the late 90s and early 2000 in sport karate and point fighting, where one of the strategies you'd see was standing side on and rotating slightly away, because shots to the kidneys and back were illegal and would be penalized. And so people, instead of having any sort of a guard position, would rotate so the shot hit an illegal area. And that's one of those things where you're like, so whatever you're aware of, and then whatever's rewarded in whatever your feedback loop is what's going to become trained into the culture, whether you intend it to happen or not. And if you don't include this sort of thing, then habits that exploit that it's illegal are going to be part of what sword fighting then is to you, whether or not you're actually doing those sorts of pieces. So like training yourself to collapse under pressure in a situation where that gets your opponent penalized, that's going to be a selection pressure in a competitive environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And same time period. The exact same time period. What like Mike was saying about informing the fencing practice, more or less, right? Just say from an MMA perspective, there's a pickup of several people that are primarily known as grapplers on the larger sense, but they would just stand up and box for whatever reason, right? And a large contributor to that, I think, is that they didn't care if they were taken down necessarily, because they had an answer for it. It's freeing, right? It frees you to fence. And I've seen that with my own folks. I'll give you an example. Swordsquatch. It's my favorite rule set. My folks the competitors I've sent didn't like it, mainly because they didn't understand it. And that's on me for not being able to explain it as well as I could have. But this is how my coaching goes. We had one competitor go against Beth, and my whole thing was, she's stronger than you and wrestles better than you. And that's all I needed to say. He still lost, but that informed how he was going to fight. There wasn't a big thing. If she grabbed him or he ringed out or whatever, there wasn't a big kerfuffle or anything. It's just that if that happened, he didn't follow the game plan. If he did follow the game plan, he did better. That kind of thing happens. And same thing locally. It's like, because we emphasize wrestling so much within the club, almost nobody likes actually wrestling when they're fencing. They want to hit people with swords. And so when other people come in, they like to keep people, they're good at keeping the distance. They're good at breaking the distance, that kind of thing, because they can see when it's happening. And that's a huge plus. And then when it happens, they're either prepared well enough or they're not. And that's not a big thing to go, oh, sheesh, what's this wrestling thing going? No, they just go, well, that other person was better than me, or I was better than that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this gets to, and this also, going back to the clip, but one of the things, ways in which that wrestling very much informs one's sword work is, I think a lot of people who come to sword work and come to weapons work wanting to go do a weapon is they are fixated on the weapon and not actually on being good at fighting, and not using, in my line, this is the Northwest, we use the whole weapon, not just pieces of it. It's we really don't want to waste any bit of it, but they get weapon fixated. And that's one of the things that happens, that is, when you have people who are used to, oh, I'm here to play with swords, is they get really stuck on pointy end goes in the other person, tap them with the end of the sword, we're working with the last third of the thing. And when you look at all your sources, when you look at all this, everything we're reading and working out of, it's all saying you're going to wind up using the whole sword, and in a bunch of it, you're going to wind up in a shanking inside too. Like your wrestling, probably you should be thinking about like something shorter and pokier coming out if you haven't found a way to shorten up that weapon. But you're looking at, like, wrestling is, I think, a route to losing that weapon fixation, where in longsword you have two hands on your sword at all times.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
When you ever take one off, and just if you're doing Fiori, getting people used to blade grabs, wraps, all that, once you start understanding pummeling for underhooks and like realizing where an overhook's a real good thing, and oh, that whizzer sometimes is really quite lovely. And maybe the thing I want a little more in some weapon-based scenarios and other things. And maybe I don't have to just use this one small piece of the two-handed sword I am using, of my long sword, or my whatever that I'm using, whether it be a single hand or whatever fight you wish to play. It's looking at fighting the person and coming to that, as opposed to, okay, we're just trying to play, we're fencing, we're purely fencing in a classical fencing sense, or a sport fencing sense.
I think a lot of the winding and like the Krieg stuff for the German guys takes on a whole different physiological awareness when you add in knee pops, shoulder butts, and head butts.
Yeah.
And even just those sorts of things, that contact can happen anywhere on the body. From a more abstract perspective, that then pushes your awareness out through the entire body and through the environment in a way that the tunnel vision on the sword or the hands changes as well, I think. Yeah.
And this is like, again, this is all in the sources. This is stuff that people talk about a great, if you look, talk about a great deal in places, and it's very present. And to not have it there is to not have that awareness. It's taking away from your actual understanding of the thing you're studying. That actually gets to, I think we're honing in on a piece that's sort of a subcategory that I brought up for things to discuss. How has wrestling, grappling informed your body use and motion in the moment? And I think that's, there's both an awareness piece that I think we're all getting at here. But when you think about how your base works, how you're walking, how you're moving, and how you hold yourself at all times, you very rarely just see someone in any grappling tournament falling down during the hand fighting stage. Like, that is not something I have generally, I haven't been to haven't haven't been to that many grappling tournaments, but competed in a few, been in a, seen a fair few. But that's, whereas in HEMA, there are a number of times I've seen people just lose it and trip early. And I think that's, that speaks to something there. And I'm curious to what other people's thoughts are on that in terms of what do you teach for body awareness there, and what are you getting in terms of how you should be moving? Anyone? Mike?
When I was thinking about this question before we started, some of the foundational things that I teach are very easy to bring to the surface with wrestling. Having a biokinetic chain so that you can be strong with less energy, rooting, in other words, and finding weaknesses in your opponent, in their stances, the kind of body sensitivity that wrestling brings. That stuff informs like the rest of your martial practice, because the directions that you're moving somebody, there's a similarity between that and how the punching vital areas, the other kinds of things we've kind of touched on are physical, like the physicality, sensitivity. It's not just about being intense, but it's also being able to have that intensity and still stay calm and have self-control over what you're doing. Like that's high level stuff. And I feel that when I want to teach people, when I want to start teaching people about these sorts of things, the first thing I kind of go to is pummeling. It's really, it's right there.
I guess that leads to the social media thing that we were talking about. That's a functional drill, right? So you can go from a straight swim pummel, right, like where you're just trading the positions, then you start moving the person around, then you can go to a free pummel, like Greco does more than folk style does. But you go to a free pummel where you're just wrestling for position. That's progressive, and it's functional. You change bodies, you get a different set of input. You switch to another person, you get a different set of input. You ramp up, you give different objectives, and a small number of different objectives, and it just becomes very, very useful.
It's sort of an ideal format for that type of like pedagogy, because you get, it's information and feedback rich, and it adapts structure at the same time. So like I've never seen a wrestler with poor structure or with a body shape that's going to, or very rarely, let's say. I don't want to say never about anything, but like a lot of the stuff that the Chinese internal folks are always trying to build up, you can get in almost no time at all with that constant kinesthetic feedback. And you don't need somebody to tell you if your posture is right. Did you move the other person? Did they move you? Did it collapse? Did it stay? Did the frame stick? And that's stuff that you can you can teach, and you can teach very effectively in a very short time, very safely, whilst building up the athletic components like your explosiveness or strength, and like I said, tendon and ligament strength, all of that sort of thing. And one of the things that I think is kind of a weird perk of that is purely through having contact across, like if you think about the parts of most people's bodies that touch the world around them routinely, like most people, it's going to be things that they're sitting with, the bottoms of their feet and their hands. So they'll probably have pretty good brain maps of those areas, and they're pretty body dumb for the rest of everything. And even just having contact with another person, contact with the environment when you're on the ground, any of that sort of stuff, literally just carving the proprioceptive maps across more of your body. In physical therapy, that's a huge rehabilitative component. You'll have people do something like a log roll, literally just roll over, and all you're trying to do is get proprioceptive feedback around the entire outside of the body. And that'll fix a lot of like stabilization issues on injuries just by itself. It recalibrates everything. And done appropriately, things like pummeling or wrestling for position on the ground, any of that is informationally incredibly dense for a lot of really subtle body systems. So you're just going to have a better sense of where your body is, how it's connected, and what it's doing if you're getting more exposure to that kind of information than you are if your contact points are, like if you're trying to feel the other person's blade work, if you think that happens in your hands, then you're missing most of what's going on. And so like I said, this is sort of an abstract way of getting into that, but that's a huge perk, that generalized kinesthetic, like interoceptive and proprioceptive sensitivity.
Yeah.
So another non-martial example would be for I've got health issues, so I'm dealing with my knee. I have no cartilage anymore, right? So I'm having to deal with that. So a lot of exercises are just not possible, right? Because of the way they are. So my current therapist is sort of a genius. So what he's doing is he's having me stand and do all sorts of these upper body exercises that have to incorporate my legs as stabilizers. And that's working wonders. It's way better than those isolated little movements that the previous one was trying to make. My upper body's getting a lot stronger, but so are the supporting structures around my knees. And that's gold. It's just because you have knowing what muscles are recruited when you do other things. That's a really good thing. That's a really good thing when you can work that into what you're doing.
Yeah, just because the scope of practice is always a tender point. So I caveat stuff where it's not necessary, but this is not medical advice to anyone.
Yeah.
But that's outside of 3/4 of our scope of practice here. Yeah. But yeah, I'd worked for a while in a physical therapy clinic, and some of the stuff we would do for people where we couldn't put a load on a knee, like after a total knee replacement or things like that, is things as simple as like, I might walk around them in a circle with a 1 pound weight and hand them the weight back and forth.
Yeah,
because
I've done that.
It's creating a really information-rich environment. For almost all of the stabilization musculature is reflexive. It's not consciously trained. So creating an environment that's going to activate all of that kind of reflexive behavioral patterns. I mean, at the speed fighting happens, most of it has to be reflexively stabilized. It has to be in that unconscious competence area, or it's going to be too slow for any sort of application. And that means training it should happen in a way that's training the parts of the brain that do that kind of behavior. And the kinesthetic feedback in wrestling, even pretty easy, like the pummeling's a really good example. It doesn't have to be high intensity to be information dense. And that's stuff that is going to fundamentally change, like the Chinese term Shenfa, the body method. You're going to build a way of moving out of that I think is assumed in a lot of the stuff that then follows from it. Can I do my I'm going to get myself in trouble brief rant at the moment?
Go for it.
As anybody who knows me knows, my favorite way of getting correct about something is to do it in public when I don't know what I'm talking about in front of people who do. So this is my wild theory on this sort of deal, specifically around motor neurons and why the academic hemo folks should also wrestle, in my opinion. So, or not motor neurons, sorry, mirror neurons. My caveat on that, a lot of the mirror neuron stuff is done in monkeys. It looks like it happens in humans too, but as far as I know, we don't have it nailed down in humans yet, but we see similar activity to what we saw in monkeys. So this could be entirely incorrect. The primary thing for mirror neurons is they fire when you're performing an activity. They also fire when you see the activity performed, whether or not you're doing it. And that's the bit that's important. So they map what somebody else is doing in your brain. There's a lot of stuff I've read about that as far as like for modeling learning, you know, you watch people so then you improve because your mirror neurons are firing along with them. That happens almost entirely with activities you're familiar with, and that's important. They did a pretty good study not too long ago between ballet dancers and capoeiristas, where they showed them videos of the other's style, and the mirror neurons for the ballerinas would fire when they were watching ballet, and the capoeiristas would fire when they were watching capoeira, but not when they were watching the other ones. So you need the exposure to the activity to get the mirror neuron to activate. Here's where I get a little sideways on this. I haven't, this is a bad pitch, so deal with it. One of the primary uses that some of the scientists I've been reading have said they think for mirror neurons is they're largely encoded for empathy and emotional transmission. And that's why we mimic each other's body language when we're in conversation. Because if I see your body language, your facial structure, your speech patterns, all that sort of stuff, and I can fire those same circuits, it'll make my body feel to me like your body feels to you, to the degree that I can copy that, which gives me a read on how you're thinking and feeling. Like I can get in your head by getting in your body by mimicking that sort of behavior. The argument I've got for the academics, so the people whose focus is on replicating the art as it was historically out of the manuals versus people who are just trying to be better at fighting and these sorts of things, is if you are not doing the practices, basically everything Charles Lynn ever posts on Facebook is this. If you're not replicating these practices, these fundamental like kinesthetic language that these authors are writing from a position of understanding on, you're going to read their writing differently than how they wrote it. You're not going to be able to get in their head unless you can to some degree get in their body. That's just how embodied cognition works. That's my crazy theory. I will not be taking questions at this time.
Oh no! I was going to ask a question. Yeah, I needed to put in my question before Andrew starts doing his critique. Is that okay? Can I ask a question about it?
Go for
Yeah,
it.
I just don't know. And like I said, we were talking about before, I do a lot of putting stuff up because I'm thinking out loud. And so while I've got y'all here, I wanted to think out loud in front of you a little bit and see what happens.
Because that's fascinating to me, right? Because me, so my standing wrestling, well, ground wrestling jits, I've never been able to glom on a judo well, probably because the pedagogy, it just doesn't jive with me. That's just the main thing, right? So my standing wrestling is Greco and Muay Thai. That's my standing wrestling. That being said, I watch Bok. I did some Shui Jiao. I'll watch sumo. I watch any other wrestling and I see something, I'm like, wow, that is cool, right? How is that different between, is that just a different level of, like you said, nerves firing? Is that like a different part of my brain thinking about that? Like you're saying the capoeiristas versus the ballet people, as opposed to me seeing a sumo person with this great form with his elbows in, shoving the person out of the ring. And I'm thinking that's ridiculously good, right? Or see a Bok throw that's set up because they have different tie-ups than I would do, but they'll do a really nice throw, and I can appreciate that, and I get really happy when I see it. So I'm not sure how that would go.
Well, I think the question you're asking is, and that's being raised is, how specific is mirror neuron firing for, and what sort of learning can occur from that, or how activity specific is that, right? And we're seeing the capoeira versus ballet, and that's external, and that's an external appearance thing, right? We do know that within types of mirror neurons, there's the stuff that's strictly imitative, and that seems to be about like replicating exactly the same pattern. And there's stuff that will fire if it goes after the same goal, right? And those are the ones that appear to be involved in skill formation. And I believe like the parietal lobe stuff where you're getting off the dorsal tract that was going off on a little while ago. So what that says, like, if and this is, again, I am by no stretch an expert on this, but like the inference I would make from that is that if you're seeing something where you're familiar with what the goal is, right? In sumo, like driving someone back across the ring, versus in Greco when you got a double inside control and you're driving someone back, versus I'm going to try and get some pressure and put someone in a cage, right? You're all work, even though they're mechanically somewhat subtly different, goal-wise, they're strategically different in terms of ultimate objectives. When you look at like what their goal is of that activity in the moment, they're all shared, and you're probably picking something up off that, right? I think that like if they're trying to do the same thing, and when you look at the capoeira versus ballet, that's a really different example, because that's straight out appearance, right? In terms of how you're moving your body, and it's not, again, neither one of them. If you look at it, I would love to see that capoeira versus ballet piece and see that done with capoeira, with a round kick from capoeira, Muay Thai, savate, right?
Yeah.
Where everyone's just trying to fucking jaw the same person,
yeah.
right? And everyone goes, oh, we're all trying to jaw the same person. Because when you look at like, when you look at like Sunshine and doing like some of his kicks, and then you look at savate, you're like, wow, that's some convergent evolution where like some of the more arty savate stuff has suddenly become like really beautiful Muay Thai from an expert, and they're nuances, and you can see how either one could converge on the other, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, that lines up exactly with where my head went with that, and with 15 minutes left, we definitely don't have time to get into the weeds on how motor patterns happen, but a super not doing this justice kind of deal is that much more so than scripting really, really tight specific patterns, a lot of this stuff is repurposing patterns that we've got sort of on the fly towards the orientation of whatever the task is. And the core, when you strip it all the way down, the core patterns oriented on a task are likely to have a lot of overlap. So I think as long as you've got that task orientation, there's especially as you get expertise, there's a huge range of degrees of freedom. Like if you watch a soccer players, between novice and expert soccer players kicking a ball into a goal, the experts tend to have a wider variation in how they perform the task. That is like when their legs extending, at what angle, all that sort of stuff. But they have a much tighter variation on the accomplishing of the task itself. And that's part of, I think, like what my Filipino martial arts teacher would always call getting your eyes in. I think part of it is being able to, one of the functions of motor neurons or mirror neurons is in predicting what the other person is, like, so we said thinking, feeling, but also doing. And that's where you start to be able to read an opponent. And in all of those other related, like task related contexts, you're still reading them because you're still attempting to solve a movement problem with a slightly different tool set or background, but you're still attempting to replicate solving a movement problem that you're seeing. And like Andrew said, even though you might find a posture in capoeira versus ballet that looks very similar, the movement problem they're attempting to solve is very different. So they may have a very similar solution to totally different tasks. And we seem to be, and this is one of the big things in coaching pedagogy that everybody, again, it's not everybody, but a lot of people get very wrong, is they get really, really hyper focused on specific solutions versus focused on creating an environment where you practice solving the task.
Yeah.
And so that makes total sense to me.
An off thought. Sorry, Dillon, I got to jump in just because I think people will appreciate this one. This is one of, I wonder if this is what's going on. You know that one of the strategies that I enjoy doing is when I pull something off on someone, I'll repeat it, right? Because generally if it worked once, it'll work again, right? But I always kind of bake it in the cake that after I've done it, at least if I've done it twice, that I'm waiting right there for them to do it back to me because I've reminded them it exists. So I'll throw something twice and then I'll be ready to counter them to try and set them up, right? And that's like,
I do exactly that. That's my favorite thing, is to introduce a novel technique, repeat the novel technique, and then immediately go into the counter for that technique, because almost without fail, that's what's coming back.
I wonder if that's exactly, I mean, you kind of wonder if that's the process that's going on there, right? Like Eric was wondering about, a reap and throw got pulled off a bunch of times yesterday in tournament, and that was the same throw he was demonstrating for the skills test. And one of the things he was wondering is, did I just prime everyone to get taken down by that? And it's like, that's an interesting question.
So obviously all of the t-shirt sales this year should go to getting a room-sized MRI or something so that we can brain scan people while they're fighting.
My eye movement tracker has to get bought first.
This conversation is making me think of a couple of old sayings. One of them is it takes level to see level. Another one is Musashi saying study widely in all professions. I wonder if it takes level to see level. If you are experienced and you develop the mirror neurons that are necessary to see the same activities in other people, that would make sense to me. The other one, the study widely, would it make sense then to actually stick yourself out there and study other things so that you can build up the contingent of mirror neurons that you can use. And the last thing is the idea of reading other people. The simple things of, somebody who's scared has their shoulders up. And there's way more subtle things about reading where people are at, and empaths and stuff like that. The development of these things have to do with that, I assume.
Yeah.
Am I on? Yeah. About the priming thing, I think that's fascinating. I never thought about it, but I do that. I do that. I do that when I'm boxing, and even when I'm doing not the HEMA side, because I still have this bit of imposter syndrome with the longsword stuff. But when I'm doing single hand weapons, yeah, I definitely do that. And as to Dillon specifically, I don't know if you've done jiu-jitsu privates before, but that's built into the pedagogy a little bit, because you're when you're starting out and you're rolling with a person who's a lot more advanced, they'll part of it is they'll purposely put you in a given position, and then multiple times, then they'll ease up, and then they'll give you that same position they just put you in to try and get an organic little bit of learning so they can do a little bit of Socratic work afterwards. So that's because then the position winds up, they got it, right? They got that position, and you didn't put them there and say, we'll start here. It just sort of happens.
Yeah.
And that, again, on the pedagogy front, that includes the context, the feedback, the before and after, all of the parts of it that get missed in overly isolating and making what I would call like imaginary drills, where you just imagine this is how things are and how they're going, rather than having it show up and get the feedback. Basically, if the coach has to be telling you the feedback, in my opinion, most of the time there's something wrong along the way. Your drill should include the feedback in whether or not it's doing what it's intended to do. And that's a different rant.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to agree with that. Yeah, that's a different topic, and then that's also dealing with but your trainees often need words to hang on to, and you're a dick if you're not talking to them. And normalizing that, like, just figure it out thing is hard for them, and that's the whole, like, that's a whole different piece.
Well, yeah, a huge part of the coaching, I think, is using the language as a maybe the least useful constraint in a constraints-led pedagogy, to highlight affordances and things like that that are possible for them. So they need exposure to see what you can do. That's part of what you were just saying, Jude, baked into that pedagogy, is that it's a pattern where, because of the speed and the intensity, or in BJJ, a lot of the times, and this is not meant in a derogatory way, the lack of it is useful in that, because you can create a situation intentionally using your skill set that elicits a particular type of response, and you can repeat that. And that gives them more and more exposure to attempting to solve that particular type of problem. And then you can offer sample solutions. But yeah, that's a very different thing from a coach who's walking around and moving your punch 2 inches to the left for what appears to be largely arbitrary reasons. There's some potential merit in that also, but it's training a different type of thing, in my opinion. And this is a wrestling talk.
Well, it gets into hands-on coaching in general, and coaching methods from wrestling as applied to other things, which is, I mean, it's given up. You give them the position, you give them the thing, you try and in a lot of ways, like, what I will wind up doing, it's like, you put pressure on them, you get, in whatever position, you put pressure on them, and you make it very hard. You give them one place where there's not pressure, so they have a door out. Okay, now you get, okay, they don't figure it out then. Okay, now you give them a bigger, open the door wider, louder. Okay, you finally heard it. Now you close that window down again, so they can try and sense the smaller window that they can get out in, or ability to create it. And that when you have that skill set from a tactile sense, you now start trying to figure out ways to apply it in free motion stuff with a sword, and realize that that's a useful skill set. But that also means, as a coach, that part of what your job is to let people hit you, because you got to figure out ways to leave those holes for them to hit you. And then how you don't make that into a bad habit for yourself as a whole, different sort of topic. But that, and that is, again, one of those things that's very hard to solve. And one of the things that people who are often just competitively quite good with swords don't understand, that that's what you need to do to try and bring someone up, in that free motion-y bit too, because that's a smaller timing window you have to live in.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, I guess this is contrasting wrestling to the fencing at a distance, right? So contrasting that, yeah, that's a major challenge. Just to say for longsword, right? You guys have sort of done this, and I'm exploring using the padded weapons myself. That gives you that freedom to work that a little bit more, right? In modern Olympic fencing or classical fencing, you have the lesson, right? So the padded up coach can take hit after hit or after hit after hit, and you can develop that skill. Boxing, Muay Thai, you have pad holders. You're a good coach. You can bring that stuff out of them really well without even having to say anything. But with what do you call it? With fencing, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. I'm not sure the padded weapons thing helps, but that's tough. How to do fight simulation without how to upgrade the software without wrecking the hardware.
So we do have a solution for that for Blospectin, and it's back in 2019, back before the world ended. This was like one of the things I was scheming about at last Swordsquatch with the Bohurt competitors that I had the privilege of coaching, which was, why don't we use our harness fectin people and Bohurt people as training dummy coaches for our fectin people, right? Because they're in armor.
Oh wow, that is cool.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. I got a network now. That's pretty cool. That's awesome.
I'm bummed Sam moved out of town, but we had him and we had him and Beth in armor for their Bohurt stuff at some of the Hemo longsword practices, and I've never gotten a chance to really dig into that as a training methodology. But when you think about it, like for Hema, it's obvious. Develop an armored program. Make sure you know that you have the eye slits. You put some mesh over the eyes and such, like take care of that piece. But that's kind of that's almost a natural for us once we actually get that piece up and running.
Wow.
I have
That's
a pad
pretty
holder
cool.
rant for another time.
Yeah. Because there are different ways of doing it, right? So that's the whole thing, right? Sorry, yeah. I'm totally the Thai guy rather than the Mayweather shoe shine guy. So that's sort of my take on it.
Oh, for pads, yeah.
So you gotta, because otherwise you just got to get good at. Because I mean, a really good Thai pad holder, you're just catching stuff the guy's throwing at you. You're not giving cues. The guy's trying to tee off on you, and you're just protecting yourself with the pads. Basically, is what's happening.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry.
We're getting around time here, folks. We're coming up on the end of this. So with that, I mean, is there any questions from the crowd and any last thoughts from people as we are coming up on time?
We have no questions from the crowd. Other than that, yeah. Is there anything else anyone else wanted to add, or I think we're good to close this down? So I have a few announcements to say. First off, thank you guys so much. Thanks so much to all of our panelists and our moderator for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you guys. I assume if we'll try and get everybody in person for Swordsquatch next year, and we'll probably do the exact same panel but in person. If not, we'll probably try and do this again next year digitally, depending on what schedules are. If you enjoyed what you experienced today, you can throw Swordsquatch a donation at paypal.com/paypalme/Swordsquatch, spelled the usual way. And that is pretty much it. Thank you guys so much. You guys have a nice evening. And there we go.
Thank you.
Nice seeing you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.